Hello, Stanton students. Welcome to Socialism and Communism, or in other words, Responses to Capitalism and Industrialization, 1750 to 1900. So, the key concept for 5.1.5 is the development and spread of global capitalism led to a variety of responses. Socialism and capitalism are two of those responses, but we'll also look at how both Qing China, the Ottoman Empire, react to capitalism by essentially not reacting to it or not embracing capitalism. So, oftentimes, you may be familiar with these two terms, socialism, communism. You may have heard them before in everyday discussions. So is there a difference between these two, between socialism and communism? Well, there are, although people tend to use these terms interchangeably. There's quite a few important differences between these. So communism is essentially a political system. It is something that would replace a government, and it would basically control most aspects of society, both the economy and government and the people and social classes. And so communism would be a stateless, classless society governed directly by the people. So this is an idealistic version or an extreme version of socialism. We have examples that exist today of socialism, but we don't really have examples of communism that exist because it's an idealistic form. It's a utopia. And so, as opposed to that, socialism can fit into a variety of political systems, and so socialism can fit into republican democracy, direct democracy. You could think of it in that terms. And so those are the differences, and at least at what kind of system it is. Communism is an idealistic, utopian political system that would replace the government. Socialism is an economic system of a redistribution of wealth. In communism, the government would own all means of production. And so there would not be any private property. So there would not be any personal possessions. Even everything would be in common ownership. And so this is kind of the ways that you can think of, well, this sounds very idealistic because it's tough to imagine any real life circumstances in which there is no private property at all, right? No private possessions at all. In socialism, in a socialistic society, personal property would still exist. People would still have personal possessions. However, most of the large means of productions, so resources, natural resources, but also factories, oil, those types of things would be in public possession, owned by everyone, or owned by the government. Also, in communism, you might have access to the articles of consumption or to everyone's possession, right? The phrase in communism is to each according to his means, to each according to their abilities, so that everybody puts into the system and takes out as they need it. In socialism, you could have wages that are distributed, people still work, and profits would be distributed among the workforce as well. Okay? Alright, so now that we have a good understanding of those terms, let's look at the history about how communism, these ideas, develop, okay? And so after the Industrial Revolution, The Industrial Revolution is essentially the product of capitalism that has been, as you remember from your capitalism lecture, that basically starts into existence a couple hundred years prior to this. You can think about the founding of the Americas, right? Basically the beginnings of capitalist companies, corporations begin then. So, after the Industrial Revolution, though, we have a new social class, a new group of middle-class workers. And some groups are particularly set in some sectors of society or sectors of work. And so women are often the ones working in textile manufacturing. Huge factories that are making clothing might be completely filled with all women workers. And so because new machines are produced, you need fewer skilled workers and more unskilled attendants, people working those machines. And so because of the division of labor within huge factories, people have an easy task that they complete on an assembly line that requires minimal thought process. You are essentially just doing the same task over and over. And as I'm sure you remember from your industrialization lecture, the results of these factories and this work is poor conditions, a lack of clean working conditions, pollution, and dangerous working conditions as well. Long working hours, low wages. And so, because of this, people eventually begin organizing and demanding better working conditions. So this is one response to capitalism, is the formation of unions, people organizing. And something that becomes apparent after the Industrial Revolution is that people are no longer producers of their own goods. So for example, where many people worked on farms before this and produced their own food and perhaps maybe produced their own clothing or their own furniture, people are no longer doing those things for themselves. And so this last point here that says the family were no longer producers and consumers, meaning they produced and made things for themselves but also bought products from others. At this point now, they have become just consumers. So you are a worker in a factory getting a wage and using that wage to consume or buy products. So we have several examples of people who are describing the conditions at this time. A popular one that you might be familiar with is Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, in which he talks about working conditions in meatpacking plants in the Chicago area around the same time, the late 1800s, early 1900s. But this excerpt is from Francis Trollope, who wrote a novel called Michael Armstrong, The Factory Boy, describing conditions in factories. And it says, a little girl about 7 years old had a job as scavenger. She was to collect incessantly from the factory floor the flying fragments of cotton that might impede the work, while the hissing machinery passed over her. And when this is skillfully done, and the head, body, and the outstretched limbs carefully glued to the floor, the steady moving but threatening mass may pass and repass over the dizzying head and trembling body without touching it. But accidents frequently occur, and many are the flaxen locks rudely torn from infant heads in the process. So what this is describing is a girl whose job is to be on her hands and knees in the factory collecting the scraps of clothing material that are cut off from these machines up above her head, right? And she's climbing underneath huge working machines, and at times some clump of her hair may get stuck in the machine and ripped out of her head, right? So it's bad enough that you might have a little girl 7 years old working in a factory that these children are often injured on the job as well. So this is the circumstances, and would be material that people who later go on to develop ideas of communism and socialism are aware of and are reading. And so this is partly what prompts them to develop such ideas. All right, and so another document that could kind of show us what people are aware of at this time, the conditions in factories that people are aware of, is from a Parliamentary Select Committee of 1833 and the Royal Commission documenting working conditions. And so they talk about excessive hours, 6 a.m. to 7 p.m., sometimes longer, short meal times, dust, filth, bad working conditions, unsanitary conditions, bending, constant bending, exhaustion, deformities from getting limbs caught into machinery, and then cruelty from managers, and if people began to try and unionize, there was often threats of violence for doing so. So people trying to unionize, basically organizing together to demand better conditions, would also often lead to managers or owners threatening violence or actually enacting violence against those people. All right, so that brings us to the concept of proletarianization, or the mechanism of the proletariat. And this is the workers entering the wage economy. Basically what we discussed before, that they lose the means of production, right? They're no longer producing items or goods for themselves. They're merely consumers, right? Working for a wage, and then buying or purchasing everything they need. And so what this leads to is a division in the classes, right? We have a large working class who all work under, most of them work under these conditions. They're paid a wage, and with that wage they purchase what they need. And the problem with capitalism is that in order to maximize profits, capitalist businesses have to keep expenses as low as possible, and part of those expenses include the wages of workers. And so what capitalism necessarily involves is seeing the worker as a unit or an expense. And it is in the business's interest to keep profits as high as possible, and therefore keeping wages as low as possible. And so that's what begins this, what Marx will call the struggle of the classes between the bourgeoisie and the proletariats. The bourgeoisie are the owners of the means of production, or the owners of the factories, the businesses, and the proletariat are the workers. All right, so two of the people who develop a lot of these ideas are Karl Marx and Friedrich Engles. They begin this partnership of working together. Essentially, Engels works and kind of supports Marx while Marx works on his writing books that explain these ideas. And so Karl Marx believes that there's a historical process of class conflict, and what he will call dialectical materialism. And what that means is that he sees the process of history as the relationship of a thesis and an antithesis, which gives us some kind of alternate argument. And so that's abstract, I know. But what that essentially means is you have one argument that might say something like, it's good that a king rules over people, absolutely, right? And you have an antithesis to that you might say, no, it's not good that a king rules over people. And so within that conversation of those two arguments comes out a synthesis of a new argument, which is maybe something like maybe someone else should hold the power, or maybe government should be structured in a different way. So anyways, that's how Marx sees the process of history. And so as a result of the Industrial Revolution, he sees that history culminates in class struggle, and that this is the result of capitalism. That capitalism inevitably produces a class struggle. And that class struggle is between the proletariats and the bourgeoisie, the workers and the owners of the means of production, right? He says that people identify out of this class struggle, and that what capitalism does is takes away people's productive abilities, right? Because, like I mentioned, people are no longer producing things for themselves, they're producing things for a wage. And for Marx, he says production or producing goods is something that gives people meaning in their lives, right? Another criticism of capitalism that Marx has is that what capitalism does is it replaces collaboration with conflict, right? And so instead of people working together for a common goal, people are pitted against one another in a capitalist system. Okay, so again, here's the kind of description of what dialectical materialism is, and I'll give another example of this here in a second. But you have a thesis and an antithesis, right? The counter to an argument, and essentially that becomes some new argument or new idea. This is how Marx sees history, as a conversation between, or a relationship between conflicting ideas that form into new ones. And so for Marx, he says we need to focus on the actual conditions of people working in factories that drive human and social interaction. And these circumstances of our lives of working in factories help shape the way that we view the world, right? And so we might say that a lot of the things that occur throughout history are based on people's ideas, or we could say their consciousness, right? But also that our consciousness is determined by how we live as well, right? And so this is how he describes people identifying themselves by their class and by conflict with another class. And so, just to give you a primary document, in Marx's 1844 manuscript, he says, "The worker becomes all the poorer the more wealth he produces. The more his production increases in power and range. The worker becomes an even cheaper commodity the more commodities he creates. With the increasing value of the world of things proceeds in direct proportion the devaluation of the world of men." So, Marx is giving kind of an alienating critique of capitalism, saying that people become alienated, or they feel that their value is less, their human value is less, the more they produce they produce wealth, right? And so the more that a worker works, the more money he is making for the owners of the means of production, but the less valued he's becoming as a person. All right, around the same time, we have others in France. So, Karl Marx and Freidrich Engles are Germans working in Germany. another movement that occurs is French Utopian socialism, which does not have the emphasis of class struggle that Marx and Engles discuss, but instead, and French socialism can typically take two forms. You can have revolutionary French socialism or utopian French socialism, and we're going to talk about a couple of the utopian French socialists. So they were not the French utopian socialists are writing in the aftermath of the French Revolution, and they saw a lot of the ills that came about as a result of the revolution, and so they're looking for a different response instead of revolution. All right, one of those was Charles Fourier. And so Fourier was very critical of both the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. He was also very critical, though, of capitalism and the idea of self-interest in capitalism. He believed, and so if you remember this about the Capitalist lecture, that Adam Smith, the capitalist philosopher, believes that self-interest is something that helps people drive the economy, right? And that all of us actually benefit from acting in our own self-interest. And so Fourier critiqued that. He thought that the industrialization was actually just a passing phase, okay? All right, and then Louis Blanc was also more of a critic of capitalism. Again, much like Marx, he believed capitalism stunted the human personality. That's kind of in the same way that it alienates the individual. And he believes that capitalism, or he believed that capitalism pitted men against other men. And you can see this when union members strike or workers strike. Factory owners will often try to bring other workers in, and what that does is turn worker against worker, right? And it makes the enemy out of another worker, right? He was a politician as well. In 1848, there was another revolution in France, and at this time he inevitably had to flee to England. Pierre Proudhon, he was an anarchist, and he is known for starting his own press in France as well. He was also involved in the revolution in 1848 in France. And so he was a member of kind of these republic revolts in France. He was jailed for for a while as well, but he was most known for putting out newspapers that critiqued the capitalist system. All right, so then I want to look at how these ideas are put into action. And so to do this, we'll look at probably the most infamous communist uprising, which is the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917. So you might touch on this a little bit when we get into the next unit and talk about communism in the 20th century in China and in Russia, but I just want to look at kind of this shift from a autocratic monarchy becoming a communist country, or a socialist country, you could say, right? And so this ends with the last Tsar, the last monarch of Russia, Tsar Nicholas II. And he's already he's put into bad conditions. He's the Tsar in World War One, when there's low morale among the army, soldiers in the Russian army. And at this time, you have those working on farms having a difficult time providing enough food for everyone. And of course, the poor working conditions that are going on everywhere in the world in factories. And so, all of this culminates in what's called Bloody Sunday, which was a protest against Tsar Nicholas. And during this protest, some of the palace guards begin firing into the crowd. It's not known exactly how many, but quite a few people were killed. Just protesters were killed. And this leads to even more anger against Tsar Nicholas, to where he's being called Bloody Nicholas. At the same time, a man named Vladimir Lenin, known mostly as Vladimir Lenin, is part of a communist ring and eventually exiled to Siberia in 1895. If you haven't talked about Siberia, that is the eastern part of Russia, where it's mostly forest and cold tundra, and it's very, very difficult conditions for living in that part of Russia. And so it's not very heavily populated, and all the way back since Tsar Ivan IV, people are exiled to this area of Russia as a form of punishment. Well, during the time when he's exiled there, Lenin begins reading many communist ideas, and when he returns in 1900, he begins the Bolshevik Party, which is a combination of workers and defects from the army, from the military. And so he supported all these ideas of common ownership of the workers and both the agrarians as well. And so he imagines a government in which the workers control the factory and the farmers as well have supply food for the country. All right. So the Bolshevik army, the Red Army, this is the defectants from the military. And in the March Revolution, this is what begins the Bolshevik Revolution. Nicholas abdicates and flees. The Bolshevik army tracks him down and eventually kills him and his family, including his children. And this begins the communist state of Russia, what we will know as the Soviet Union, which will last for 74 years, up until 1989. All right, which we'll talk about that more. We'll talk about the communist state more, but this is just an example of communists actually coming to power in Russia. All right, so just to mention a couple of alternate responses to capitalism. One would be the Qing dynasty, especially under Dowager Cixi. Dowager Cixi is known for beginning some economic reforms, but inevitably she halts these reforms. This would include reforms for the railroads and telegraphs, etc. And what happens is she will eventually put a young boy into power as emperor after she dies. And so, this is capped off by the Boxer Rebellion, and this is a rebellion that was deeply anti-foreign, essentially meaning skeptical of European capitalists in the countries, and many of the people involved in this rebellion believed that these new products, these new inventions like the telegraphs and steam engines were offending local gods. So this is a good example of a reaction to capitalist industrial progress. The Ottoman Empire is another good example. By the end of the 19th century and beginning in the end of the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire was not able to keep up with the industrialization of Europe. And after World War I, we'll see this in another different lecture as well, but Ottoman is essentially broken up after World War I and becomes the state of Turkey. So, the Ottoman Empire was known for producing quite a few goods, textiles, and weapons at the height of their empire. But, again, like I mentioned, they're not able to keep up with Europe towards the end of their empire, and they begin having to borrow money from European banks, loaned to them at high interest rates, which they could not repay. And so, something that you can take away from these two examples, after the Qing dynasty in China, and you might say as a result of not being able to keep up with capitalist industrialized Europe, China eventually goes into a state of civil war. And the Ottoman Empire, as a result of not being able to compete with Europe, that is exploding in production at this time, they inevitably have to borrow money from them, and they too kind of decline into and form a nation state.